I'm Ed Stetzer. I'm the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology. I am your host this and every Saturday on Ed Stetzer Live. I'm being told that I'm glitching a little bit on technological means. So Merle, let me know if we need to do anything else. Very good. So we're going to figure that out. So please forgive us as we're having a couple of glitches here and there. But hopefully we'll get this technology figured out in just a second. Our guest today is actually Sharon Hodde Miller, and hopefully you can hear me saying that. She's a PhD. She always Merle tells me we're doing better. Sharon leads at the Bright City Church in Durham, North Carolina, which she co-founded with her husband Ike. She's the author of several books, including The Cost of Control, Why We Crave It, The Anxiety It Gives Us, and The Real Power God Promises. I'm very excited about having a conversation about this book. I really appreciate Sharon. I've had the privilege of publishing her writing in multiple contexts as well. She's quite the thinker and really an excellent writer. And I want to commend to you her book, The Cost of Control. And again, it's Why We Crave It, The Anxiety It Gives Us, and The Real Power God Promises. And again, she's written widely in multiple other books. You can go to edstetzerlive.com. And once you go to edstetzerlive.com, it links to her bio, all of her books there as well. Sharon, thanks for joining us again. You're a return guest here on the program.
I know. It's so good to be back with you.
Well, good. I'm glad our technology seems to have resolved itself. So hopefully we'll continue to have clarity of the phone calls. All right. So you've written this book. One of you again. You're right. I'm a little jealous. I have a meeting with my publisher on next week, and they're going to yell at me because I'm 7 years late to publishing a book I signed a contract for. So you, on the other hand, seem to meet the deadlines and to publish the book. So and it's a gift to all of us. So we appreciate you. I need to learn from you. Okay. So obviously the title of the book is The Cost of Control. Now, I want to kind of start in and around the conversation with some definitions. Why, what's the definition of control? Why did you write a book about it? Let's talk about it.
So I would define control as the power to impose your will or to determine desired outcomes. And so that's how I would give a working definition of control. But the way that I came to this topic, it's actually crazy to think about. It's been 5 years now since the pandemic started. And that was the original seed of the idea, because I was watching how Christians were responding in 2020. And the way I think about any trial, any storm that Christians face, that the church faces, is that they always have this revealing element to it. It kind of exposes what was going on underneath. And so I was paying really close attention to how Christians were responding in 2020. And what became very clear to me is that we were scrambling in the absence of predictability, in the absence of control. We sort of had this intolerance for uncertainty. And so we were scrambling for control, and people express this in different ways. And so for me, as a teacher, as a leader, as a writer, I thought this is something I want to dig into more. However, I will tell you, at the time, if you had asked me if I struggle with control, I would have said, no, I do not. And I was honestly pretty judgy about it. So I could point to other people and say that person has a major control issue, but I do not. And one of the things that I learned in the process of researching for this book is that one thing humans are very gifted at is rebranding control as something good. So I'm not controlling this person. I'm just helping them. I'm not controlling the situation. I just know what is best. And so it was helpful for me to do this research and understand this topic better, just personally. It revealed a lot in my own heart.
Fascinating. I'm intrigued by the topic because I think that, I think I'm probably a person who struggles with this, and so I'm an Enneagram 8, and that's kind of maybe a defining characteristic in some of those areas as well. But it appears that you're writing a book about control at a time when the culture feels out of control, and it feels like we're this tumult and turbulence. We're spinning out of control. And it's led to a real sense. I mean, the book The Anxious Generation comes to mind. Our
Yes.
culture is people are very anxious. What's the relationship with this growing sense of anxiety and this growing desire for control? How does it all fit together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was something that was so fascinating to me. To answer your question, actually, I want to back up a little bit if you're okay with it and just give this whole conversation a theological and biblical foundation.
Love it.
Because one of the things that I learned is that control isn't something that some people struggle with. It's something that all people struggle with. And the reason for that is going back to Genesis 3, this moment in the garden where Adam and Eve have everything that they need to thrive. They have freedom, they have love, they have relationship, they have purpose, but they don't have control. They have this single boundary on their will. And ultimately, they decide that they would be more empowered without that boundary. And so they defy the single boundary that God has placed on their will. They reach for more power, more knowledge, more control. And what is really important to understand, there's really two things that are important to understand about that moment and its impact for all of us. The first is that single moment in time, it sort of rewrote the blueprint of all of creation. You know, sin sent cracks throughout all of creation. But as descendants of Adam and Eve, we are now doomed to reenact that moment again and again and again. And so anytime we are reaching to control something God has not given us control over, we are reenacting that moment. And so that's why it isn't some people are control freaks, some people are not. No, we all struggle with control. It's just what form does it take for you? So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is that not only are we doomed to reenact that moment, we are also doomed to reenact its consequences. And so every time we try to control something that we cannot control, we will experience the same consequences as Adam and Eve. And that's what the title is referring to with the cost of control. And so there's a lot of different consequences. One is broken relationships. When you try to control people, it breaks your relationship with them. But the first consequence that we see is actually fear and anxiety. We think that it's shame because Adam hides, but that's not what it says in the Hebrew. It says he's afraid. And so there's now this integral relationship between control and anxiety, which it's kind of a paradox when you think about it, because we run to control when we feel anxiety. We think that control is going to soothe our anxiety, but it actually only makes our anxiety worse. It only ratchets it up even more. And one of the funny ways that we experience this is whenever you have like a medical issue, like you feel pain in your elbow. And so you go to WebMD looking for information. So you're doing the exact same thing Adam and Eve did. The first thing they reached for control was knowledge. We do that when we go to WebMD. But when we go to WebMD, do we walk away feeling empowered, feeling in control, feeling at peace? Has anyone ever in the history of the world walked away from WebMD feeling better about themselves? No. You walk away from WebMD certain that you are going to die, that it is the worst case scenario. And so I think that's a really great example of how we reach for something thinking this is going to give me predictability. This is going to give me control, but it actually robs us of peace instead of giving it to us. And so that is why control and anxiety have that relationship.
Fascinating. Okay. I love how deeply you've thought on this subject. And to be perfectly honest, I have not thought as deeply as you have on this subject. Maybe I need to. Maybe this is like a wake-up call for me. I'm not quite sure. Okay. So I'm back to then the question of anxiety in our culture and its relationship with control. Just unpack that. I'll also remind people that they can call in 877-548-3675. Maybe you have a question about how you might walk through a moment without an overwhelming desire to control, or how you might, I don't even know, are we allowed to use the phrase let go and let God, how all that fits? 877-548-3675. Again, that's 877-548-3675. So that connection between control and anxiety, unpack that a little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you mentioned The Anxious Generation, that book, and that is a book that if you are a parent listening, I recommend highly. I recommend that book
Really?
to everyone, every parent that I know. I've recommended that book. And there's a lot going on in that book. Some of it overlaps with this conversation, some of it does not. But one piece that he touches on, and there's another author named Jean Twenge. Have you read any of her
Nope.
books? She has a book, I think it's called iGen, and she is, I believe, a social psychologist. And so she looks more at kind of next gen, what's going on. But what both of them have noticed that is so fascinating is that Gen Z is the safest generation ever. That like
Hmm.
all levels of drug use, of car accidents, of early deaths, risky behavior, whatever it is, by every metric, Gen Z, we have done a great job of just bubble wrapping this generation. But what is so fascinating, one of the things that Jean Twenge says, and I think Jonathan Haidt picks up on in The Anxious Generation, is that it's almost as if we have exchanged physical safety or physical danger, maybe is a better way of putting it, for emotional danger. It's as if they have not, because we have done such a good job of protecting them, they have not developed the toolkit to live in the actual world. And I think that's another really interesting angle on this whole control conversation, is how it interfaces with being a parent. Because on the one hand, yes, we are supposed to protect our children, shepherd our children, discipline our children, teach them, all of that. But we are not meant to control them. And if we try to control every aspect of their lives, if we try to be these helicopter parents that just get in between them and anything that could ever cause them any harm, there is actually a cost to that as well. And I think in Anxious Generation, he does a really good job of teasing that out and encouraging parents that there is a healthy tension here, that we've kind of swung too far in one direction, but that when we try to control our children or any relationship in our life, that also comes with a cost. And the cost that we are seeing in young people is greater levels of anxiety.
Fascinating. Okay, we're going to continue our conversation with Sharon Hottie Miller. She's got a new book. This broke up a little bit at the beginning, so you may not have heard all this. Let me tell you again. It's called The Costs of Control, Why We Crave It, the Anxiety It Gives Us, and the Real Power God Promises. We're taking your calls about maybe how you might navigate some of these questions about control and trusting God and walking through. 877-548-3675. Again, our number, 877-548-3675. Okay, we're back. Ed Stetzer Live. I'm Ed Stetzer. I'm the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology. Or Merle, our engineer, told me I should tell us again. We had a little technological challenges earlier. And again, you're listening to Ed Stetzer Live this and every Saturday at this time. We come to you with hopeful and helpful, I hope, conversations about church, culture, and mission. And so today our guest is Sharon Hottie Miller, where her book is The Cost of Control, Why We Crave It, the Anxiety It Gives Us, and the Real Power God Promises. It's interesting, Sharon, I kind of was unsure like how people would respond to the topic, but it's pretty fascinating to see that callers have just lit up. So this is something, and not every conversation produces a lot of phone calls, but you can sort of tell when something is on people's heart and mind. And so we're going to get to calls in just a moment. Let me again share the number with you. If you want to call in, we're talking about the cost of control. We're talking about how control works and the anxiety it gives us. And really the alternative of that is the power God promises. Our number is 877 548 3675. Again, that's 877 548 3675. Now, in the book, you talk about how God doesn't give us maybe the control we crave. But he does give us influence. We do have the ability to influence. What does that mean? What's the distinction between those two?
Yeah, the word that I use in the book, it's not a biblical word, it's a psychological term, but it's one that I found helpful, which is agency. So we don't have control, but we do have agency. And what that word means is influence over yourself and your circumstances. And the difference between agency and control, there's really a number of differences. I would say that agency, unlike control, it operates within limits. It honors the fact that we are limited people, whereas control tries to defy them. But the other big difference I would say is that control is concerned with outcome. It really wants to engineer to guarantee an outcome, whereas agency is more accepting what influence do I have, even though I can't guarantee an outcome. And when we look at Genesis 1 and 2, so before this reach for control in Genesis 3, we see Adam and Eve operating with profound and powerful agency. And it takes a lot of different forms. And so I go into, in the book, I list like a lot of different forms of agency. But the funny thing about it, whenever I talk about agency, I always feel like I have to preface it by saying every form of agency I'm going to tell you is going to be profoundly disappointing to you because very often what people are asking when they say, okay, if I can't control, what can I do? What they're really asking is, how do I still control the situation? How do I still get the outcome that I want without controlling the situation? And so just to preface it by saying that's not what this is. But when we look at Adam and Eve in Genesis 1 and 2, we see one form of influence that they have is naming and ordering. And one example I often tell people, again, that doesn't feel like this really powerful influence, but in my own home, something that I have struggled with, especially my kids are a little bit older now, but when they were little, I very often tried to impose my will with the volume of my voice. I have all three of my kids are highly loud and extroverted. And so I would try to control them and silence them by being louder than them, which doesn't make any sense. But that didn't help. That didn't subdue their wills to mine. It really just, as control does, it sort of fractured my relationship with them. It put strain between me and them. But one thing that has helped in our household is just having better systems, being more organized, having schedules, things like that, which didn't necessarily transform them magically into these law-abiding citizens, but it actually helped. It helped with the chaos. It helped with the disorder without the cost to my relationship with them. And so that's one form of influence that we see, is that sometimes we feel out of control simply because we are disorganized, and there is a better way to do things. But another form of agency that we see Adam and Eve ultimately fail to exercise, and again, I'm going to say this is going to feel very disappointing, but is self-examination. Because right after they make this decision to rebel against God and sin, God asks Adam, "Where are you?" And this is a rhetorical question. He is not wondering, that the omniscient God of the universe isn't stumped by Adam's great hiding place. This is a rhetorical question where he is asking Adam, can you just stop for a second? You are spiraling out of control right now. Can you just stop and examine yourself and ask how you got here? Like, what is going on in your interior world? And unfortunately, Adam is not able to do that. Instead, he does what we always do when something's out of control, is we point to something outside of ourselves. God's saying, what's going on inside of you? And we point to something outside of us. This is honestly one of the most important things for us to do when we feel out of control, is to stop and self-examine, invite the Holy Spirit to search us and ask, why do I think imposing my will on this situation is going to heal this person or fix this broken situation? Why am I running to control as if it can offer me the peace that only Jesus can provide? That is some of the most important work that we are called to do, invited to do, empowered to do when things are spiraling out of control. But it is also probably one of the hardest things to do. And so there's a number of other forms of influence that we have, but that influence that we have over ourselves, another profound one is prayer, which not only, takes the issue to the God of the universe who is in control, but also empowers us to walk in the spirit, not the flesh. There's so many different forms of influence, but those are just a few.
That's good. It's good. Let's take some calls as well. Actually, we have a call from Sharon. Sharon in Florida. Sharon, you're live on the air. Go ahead with your question or your comment. Okay, we'll maybe come back to Sharon if we can check and see if she's going to be available. Let's go to Tony in West Chicago. Tony, you're live on the air. Go ahead with your question or your comment.
Yes, there's a couple of issues that I'm hearing on the radio. First of all, the issue of Generation Z, incredible anxiety levels, and then, of course, the issue of control. And it brings to mind a question for me is that as a Christian parent, I had to recognize that in working with my children, there were times when I had to lovingly correct them physically for disobedience and so on. That is completely now out of the picture certainly in terms of secular America, even possibly Christian America. So I'm wondering if maybe some of the issues that we're seeing in Generation Z that has been possibly raised in an environment where physical discipline and administered in a loving way hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, let me give you first, Tony. I'm going to give you a copy of Sharon's book, The Costs of Control, Why We Crave It, the anxiety it gives us, and the real power God promises. And I mean, Sharon, is kind of question and theme is in and around maybe how we interact with our children. Has maybe we can talk about different levels of that. Has that impacted these things?
Absolutely. And, that is a question I get all the time is how do I give my kids appropriate boundaries without straying into this realm of control? And I think this is something that requires so much wisdom and so much prayer. But one way that has been really helpful for me to think about it is the boundary that God gave Adam and Eve. As I already mentioned, they had tremendous freedom in the garden, but not absolute freedom. They had this boundary that was there for their safety, their security, and their good. They didn't recognize it that way, but that boundary was actually a part of their freedom and a part of their flourishing. And I think that is a really helpful way of thinking about our role as parents, is that our job is to give our kids age appropriate, developmentally appropriate boundaries that are going to contribute to their freedom and their good. And when they are little, that boundary has to be real tight because you are just trying to keep that kid alive. Toddlers are great inventors of ways to harm themselves. And so you're going to have that tight boundary because you have to physically protect them. But as they get older, as they grow, as they mature, it is important and developmentally appropriate to continue to expand that boundary out further and further so that they are able to exercise their freedom and learn how to be a person in the world. And ultimately, when they become adults, it's not your job to put boundaries around them anymore. Your relationship changes. But one thing that I would say about Gen Z and anxious generation that I think in that book, Jonathan Haidt really exposes is one way that parents have failed to protect their children, which is actually their relationship with smartphones and with the internet, which is that we're kind of saying, I'm going to keep you physically safe, but then handing them a smartphone and saying, saying, just do whatever you want on the internet. And Jonathan Haidt is making the case that that is not developmentally appropriate for them, that we've actually failed to impose age-appropriate boundaries in their use of the internet. And because of that, they now have this really unhealthy relationship with it. And so I would say that is one area in which both the world and the church, there's definitely a learning curve that we need to catch up on. What does it mean to have age-appropriate boundaries for the internet?
Fascinating. Okay, we're going to continue our conversation on the other side. Again, our phone number, we're going to invite you to call. We have several good callers lined up. We're going to get to Raj and Janet right after the break. We're at 877-548-3675. We're talking about control and why we crave it. Anxiety gives us the real power God promises. The cost of control is the title of the book. Sharon Hodde Miller is our guest. We're going to get to your calls right after the break. 877-548-3675. Hey, we're back. Ed Stetzer live. I'm actually broadcasting from Houston, Texas today. I'm going to be speaking tonight at the Lanier Theological Library. I'd invite you, but it is a sold-out event. It's the last stop of my Lead the Way tour. If you follow me on social media, you know that I've hit 21 locations, talked to about 10,000 pastors and church leaders in the last 6 months, partly talking about Talbot School of Theology, talk about the state of the church. We've had some guests talking about some new religion research and data. So thanks for your patience with our earlier technology challenge. On the road, sometimes these things do happen. The great thing is we're getting to your calls. Our phone number is 877-548-3675. And we're going first to Raj, frequent caller, friend of the show now. Raj, you're live on the air. Go right ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, if we didn't have control in our lives when we were younger, is it possible that when we become adults, we overcompensate and maybe try to control more than we should?
That's a super good question. By the way, I'm going to let Sharon answer that question, but the answer is yes, as someone who experienced that. But anyway, I'm going to give you a copy, Raj, of the book. Remember, Karen, our producer, will come on, give you the costs of control. Sharon, I sort of answered the question. I'm sorry. Maybe you have a different opinion. What do you think?
No, that is such a great question. And I think that is something that so many people can relate to. Honestly, there are people in my life, in my family, that is their story, especially if you grew up in a home, maybe one of your parents was an alcoholic, for example, and there was just a high degree of chaos. It is very normal to grow up as an adult and to try to retrieve what you did not have. And one thing that I would say to anyone listening who that is your story is, I think too often the church often talks about control in a very narrow category, which is just that control is sin, that it's pride, that it's arrogance. And it can be those things. But sometimes we struggle with control because even though we have inherited this post-Genesis 3 world that is defined by brokenness and chaos, is that we were created for Genesis 1 and 2. We were created for security and for stability and for peace. And so when you desire those things, especially if you grew up without those things, when you desire those things, that was put in you by God. And so for you to know that he is actually more invested in you having security and stability than even you, but to also know that just where we go off the rails is how we try to get back to the garden, so to speak, how we try to get that security, how we try to get that peace, because control just doesn't have it. We're trying to get something that only Jesus can provide. But all that to say, if that is your story, that God has so much compassion for you, especially because he intended for you to have security and peace.
You know, James from Lillington, North Carolina, he called in to ask this. I wanted to ask Sharon about Gen Z young men. Because we just talked about this in the program we did from London and talked about how a lot of young men really there's a crisis of young men. They don't feel they have a control or the positive future, the anxiety that's there. And James asking, do you see some connection to that? People coming to Christ in the midst of us kind of losing control in the world around us? What do you think?
I will say this is something I've not thought as much about. One thing I feel like Jonathan Haidt is an unofficial sponsor of this conversation, but one
Oh, it
thing
is.
that he talks about in that book is how men get so addicted to video games because men especially crave agency in their lives, and that video games give men, and honestly it's similar with pornography, it gives men this false form of agency, and so it makes them feel empowered, it makes them feel influence. And so that is one of the reasons why video games, why pornography is so especially addicting for men. I think that is so interesting. I have two boys, and so I think about that a lot in terms of their relationships with video games. But I also think that that is a really fascinating factor for church leaders to be thinking about that if God created men with this desire for agency in their lives, are we discipling them in that? Are we giving them opportunities to exercise their agency in the church, to have leadership in the church? Questions around that I think are really fascinating. And that's about as far as I have thought about it, but I do think that's really
Well,
interesting.
I think that's good. I mean, it's a good thought because I think of like, and James, thanks for your call. We're going to give you a copy of Sharon's book. Our producer Karen will come on and give you a copy of The Cost of Control: Why We Crave It. It gives us and the real power God promises. Because I do think of like so much of what young men are attracted to on the bad side of things, like Andrew Tate. I mean, that's all about control and
Mhm.
in just in horrible, ungodly ways. And so to see how we wrestle with that, I think it's kind of an important question. Well, by the way, a little while ago we went to Sharon in Florida, but the reason is I had her name wrong. It's actually Janet in Florida. Janet, you're live on the air with your question or comment. Sorry for messing up your name.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, I really want to give glory to God because of the way He works. A situation came up in my life where I just couldn't deal with it. And I know now from the studio it's about control. I come from a childhood of my dad was super controlling every aspect of my life to the point when I was 19 years old, I was convinced that I couldn't make decisions for myself. So I let him call all the shots, including who I married, which that marriage ended in divorce. Long story short,
I'm sorry.
it's like this is the time I know that God is dealing with the control in my life. And listening to your program, it's like you gave me the context of, oh, this is what I'm doing. And I would love a copy of the book, but I was wondering if there are any scriptures besides, be anxious for nothing, but nothing through prayer and supplication, etc., that you could point me to before, I'm going to order the book, but in the meantime.
No,
I
I'm
know
going to
now
give you the book,
kids-
Janet. Let me give you the book, but let's see what Sharon can share about that. But you hold on the line for just a second, and we'll send you a copy. Our producer will come on, get your address of The Cost of Control. So what do you think? I mean, one of the things you need to know about Sharon's book, and it is very theologically and scripture rich. So what other places would you point?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of one verse in particular because honestly, there are just so many. I
Right,
think
and you sort of build biblical and theological themes rather
Mhm,
than particular memory verses in the book. But yeah, well, please
mhm.
tell us more.
There's not one in particular that jumps out to me. A broader category that I would say to meditate on if you struggle with control is any psalm, particularly about the character and goodness of God, because so much of this comes down to whether or not we trust God, whether or not we believe that his plans for us are good. Another metaphor that I often think about when it comes to control is when I am flying on a plane. If I trust the pilot, I am not going to have a lot of anxiety about that flight. But if I don't trust the pilot, I'm going to be gripping my seat. I'm going to be, breathing heavily, heart racing, all of that, because I don't trust the pilot. And me gripping the seat or having anxiety isn't making me any safer. I'm still, at the end of the day, my life is in the pilot's hands. But the question for all of us at the end of the day is, do we trust the pilot? Like, do we trust him? And if we do trust him, if we do believe that his plans for us are good, and if we do more than anything else believe that regardless how this particular situation plays out, that in the end, we know where all of this is going. We know that Jesus literally means God has skin in the game, that he is more invested in healing whatever this particular situation is. He's more invested in it than even you are. And so if you trust that, if you trust him, then we can let go. And I'm not going to say let go and let God. I'm not going to say that.
I felt bad about it.
But for me, I think a lot of it is, do we trust, unlike Adam and Eve in the garden, when Satan is basically saying, God's been holding out on you, this guy is not trustworthy, you could have more. Do we believe that, or do we actually trust the pilot? So not a specific verse, but any passage about the goodness and trustworthiness of God.
Yeah, and I'd say, again, biblical and theological themes are throughout The Cost of Control. Make sure you get a copy of the book. If you go to edstetzerlive.com, you can find the links right to there for the book and also to other books Sharon has written. We've had her on the program a couple of times, I think, in the past. She's a friend of the show now, so we love that. We have one more segment. We're going to get right to your calls. Call it 877-548-3675. Talk to us about The Cost of Control, 877-548-3675. Okay, we're back. I promise we're going to go right to the call. So let's go to Margaret in Palatine, Illinois. And Margaret, you can tell us a little of the background about you and Sharon.
Oh, hi. Hi, Sharon. I went by Margie at the time, and I was in a couple of classes with you at TEDS many years ago now. Hi. How are you?
Good.
So nice to hear you. I have a question. As I'm aging, as we all are, I find that my need for control is increasing to quite a high level of anxiety about outcome of medical tests, housing decisions, what's going on with my adult children, that kind of thing, much more so than when I was working full-time and busy and teaching and so forth. And I wonder if you have done any research on that kind of cycle of control as we get throughout our lifetime and as we get older.
Margaret, let me let you know too. We're going to give you a copy of the book. So hold on just for a second, and Karen will give that to you. Go ahead, Sharon.
I've not done any research on that specifically. I have written some about the relationship between control and our bodies, because that is another area where our culture really promises a significant amount of control, that you can control the aging process, that you can control your health. I mean, so much of what is marketed to us is promising this illusion of control, that if you take these supplements or if you eat this specific diet, that you can protect yourself. But what we all know as we age is that we cannot, that aging is inevitable. But if we have bought this lie, essentially, that we can control our bodies, what ends up happening, and we see this again in Genesis 3, one of the first costs of control is this broken relationship between Adam and Eve and their own bodies. This body shame exists for the first time. And so when we try to control our bodies, what is going to happen ultimately is we make an enemy of our bodies. Because if we believe that our bodies will submit to us, sooner or later, they are going to betray us. And so while another form of agency I have written about, taught about, is how we have agency over creation, and that includes our bodies. And so we can take care of our bodies, we can exercise, we can eat healthy, but at the end of the day, we don't have control over our bodies. And so I have found, just as I've gotten older, I've also been just confronted with that reality. And it has exposed to me how I thought I had a good relationship with my body. Actually, no, my body was just submitting to me. And so that was an illusion that I had. As far as just that cycle of life, I don't have as much to say, but more just to say that it is difficult. I think anytime we go through that sort of transition and are confronted with those things, it is difficult. But to reiterate what I said in our last segment, that I think God has so much compassion for us in that process as well.
Yeah, so good, so good. Let's go to Della in Indianapolis. You're live on the air, Della. Go right ahead.
Oh my goodness. I didn't realize how shy that I am. Pertaining control over your body and someone who is suffering with anxiety, it's not a very helpful thing to say to oneself. So I think we need maybe a different answer for that, but that's not what I was going to talk about.
Well, please jump right into what you're going to talk about, Della.
Okay. As someone who was going to get married and marry someone who was going to move to Alaska, it was very difficult because I had a very good job, and I was going to have to leave that job, and panic attacks started. And because I was saying to myself, okay, who will I be? And that started the ball rolling, and kind of got on that wheel, couldn't get off that wheel after a lot of, and I didn't know what panic attacks were because they weren't discussed. They weren't talked about at that time.
Sure.
It was 1995. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. After a lot of
no worries. You were talking
counseling.
some about panic attacks. So tell us
Yes.
what your question is for Sharon, though.
Well, I was just going to say that after a lot of counseling, a lot of trying to figure out how to fix the panic attacks, I found that just letting go, and I pictured an umbilical cord for myself to God, and that seemed to really help. And hearing about Adam and Eve, what you're saying about Adam and Eve, makes a lot of sense. It's really helpful. And do you have any more helpful tips for me as someone who struggles with panic attacks and having control over my body and what to say to myself?
It's a super question, Della. Let me say too, though, before we jump in, Sharon, that neither Sharon and I are necessarily counselors in this particular context. So I do want to encourage you with panic attacks to partnership with your local church, and if you need to talk to a mental health professional as well, we're very much in favor of that. Sharon, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Ed, because this does overlap with that conversation as well. But honestly, I think you're already doing it. It sounds like you are taking the steps. In an earlier segment, I talked about the importance of self-examination, of stopping and inviting the Holy Spirit to search your interior world, because so often what is tempting, in that situation specifically, it would be tempting to say, I am having panic attacks because of this thing that is happening outside of me. And if I can fix this thing that is happening outside of me, then I will feel better. But what God is often inviting us to do, the spiritual work he is inviting us to do, is to not place all the blame on that thing happening inside of you, but to look inside and to ask, what part of me is looking for security and peace in something other than Jesus. What is really going on underneath this? And some of that is spiritual work, and some of that is mental health work. And so I want to just reaffirm what Ed said about that. But the fact that you are going to counseling and that you're aware of that layer underneath going on, there's not a quick fix here, but that is such an important step to take that I really just want to commend you and encourage you to keep going.
So good. I totally agree. Sharon, in the last, we got a couple minutes left in the show. In the last section of the Cost of Control, you really talk about the real power, the actual power that God promises us. What's most exciting about that for you?
So I've already talked some about the power of agency, and really there's multiple forms of power that I look at. We have this God-given agency that I would say is common to all of humanity. Like it's part of what makes us human. It's what distinguishes, one of the things that distinguishes us from animals. It's something that reflects God. It's the image of God in us. We also have the power of the Holy Spirit at work in us. And I look at what is self-control, because that translation of the Greek is a little bit of a misnomer, that we're not really talking about controlling the self when we are exercising self-control. What we're talking about is walking in the Spirit instead of the flesh. And so responding to situations in the power of the Spirit instead of our own human effort. But the most important power that is available to us, and I've said this many, many times, is a person, and that is Jesus. That is the hope that we hang our hat on at the end of the day, because the fact of the matter is you can do everything right. In whatever broken situation you find yourself in right now, you can exercise self-control. You can exercise godly agency. You can self-examine. You can go to therapy. You can, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, that negative outcome might still come. But what we know is that where this is going, Jesus is going to heal it all. And that is what we hope in. So good. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of our program today. Let me thank my team in Chicago. We've got our great producer, Karen Hendren, and Lisa Jempty as well, engineer Merle St. James, Rihanna on the phones. To hear today's program again, go to edstetzerlive.com. You can also subscribe there via podcast. And Ed Stetzer Live is a production of Moody Radio, a ministry of Moody Bible Institute. Thanks for listening.
Love what you're hearing? Get more with the Moody Radio app. Stream live local radio, enjoy music channels from contemporary worship to urban praise, and discover all 40 of our on-demand podcasts with personalized notifications. All your favorite Moody Radio content in one place. Download today.